Hi, my name is Holly. I'm a manager at Edison Ford Winter Estates. Each month I do a topic in history for you, and this month it's on the Underground Railroad. And I want to tell you that there is a lot of information, and then there's a lot of things that are yet to be discovered, and I'm only touching on a little of it. So I hope this will inspire you to go ahead and research and find out more information on your own. The history of the Underground Railroad. And this picture is from the Library of Congress from 1821. And in 1513, Africans arrive in Florida with Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon, the first European to claim Florida. September 8th, 1858, St. Augustine is founded nearly a half a century before Jamestown by Don Pedro Menendez de Avites, who arrived from Spain with 800 colonists, including approximately 50 Africans, both free and enslaved. And the Africans brought by Menendez become a vital part of America's first colony. In 1687, 11 enslaved Africans, 8 men, 2 women, and a nursing child, escaped from the Carolinas and arrive in St. Augustine. Governor grants their request for sanctuary with the caveat that they had to be baptized in the Catholic Church, which they were, and hired the men as paid labor at Castillo de San Marcos. He refused British demands to return the escapees. And I'll let you decide about, yes, they do have their freedom, but they also had to agree to take on another religion or another faith. So think about that. But he did not return them. And in 1693, Spanish King Charles II issued a royal decree granting freedom and protection to all enslaved Africans escaping British colonies if they converted to Catholicism and served Spain. In 1619, so we're going back, this is another group. The Dutch introduced captured Africans to America, planting the seeds of a slavery system that evolved into a nightmare of abuse and cruelty. And this picture is from later because it shows the changing government and views and other things. Now, in 1738, and I think I'm going to go back here for a minute. I also want you to know that Fort Moses established in Florida, and an enslaved man from the British, formerly enslaved man, is now appointed captain of the fort. And this is a place where there's freedom for all blacks that are there. But in 1740, there's a conflict between Spain and Great Britain, and James Oglethorpe, who is British, lays siege to St. Augustine with British forces, and they capture Fort Mose, forcing the inhabitants to go to St. Augustine. This was just outside. It was rebuilt in 1759, and there are 67 free African American or Black residents. They live in 22 houses. Great Britain, it keeps on going back and forth, and St. Augustine is nearly wiped out. The Fort Mose community, and most of them relocate to Florida, and it was abandoned permanently. In 1763, Great Britain claims Florida, and that ends the French and Indian War, and nearly all of St. Augustine's people are gone. But then in 1776, what happens? We have the Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are created equal, while rejecting any anti-slavery language to win Southern support of this for the American Revolution. St. Augustine's British subjects burned the Declaration along with effigies of John Adams and John Hancock. But the revolution comes with an end that allows Spanish to reclaim Florida from the British in 1783. But I want you to think about that. All men are created equal. African American men are counted as 3/5 of a person. That's part of the enslavement system. And I will go on, but let me say that things just seem to keep on getting worse over time until Florida in 1821 becomes a U.S. territory. And that is a setback. for African Americans and their descendants. They didn't have any civil rights, and though they had to become, unfortunately, they had become Catholic, their rights were protected by the Spanish. More enslavement, and then I'll get to the Underground Railroad because I want to set the stage as to why there was such a need. And by the way, the map I'm in front of shows some of the routes of the Underground Railroad. Native Americans were also enslaved following the Pequot War, when Pequots were sold into slavery in Bermuda, the West Indies, and farmers in the colony of Massachusetts. Enslaving Africans continued in 1640 at Jamestown and was fully institutionalized, very sadly, by 1660. By 1700, all the 13 colonies had enslaved people, mainly Africans, and the only objection to this practice, of course, was in the African American community. But among whites, it only came from the Quakers of Pennsylvania in 1688, who condemned slavery as immoral and anti-Christian. Following the American Revolution, the slave trade increased as more land was taken from the native people of North America, so they needed more labor to work the land. The earliest mention of the Underground Railroad. So there's all kinds of enslavement going on here. And I didn't get to touch on everything, nor all the heroic people that worked on the Underground Railroad. As I said, I know this is very limited, but I hope that it will inspire you to look into more on your own. The earliest mention of the Underground Railroad came in 1831, when an enslaved man named Tice Davids escaped from Kentucky into Ohio, and his owner blamed an Underground Railroad for helping Davids to freedom. And I will tell you that we don't actually know when this is a good guess, but there'll be other people that think it's later, that it's sooner. And there were definitely people that were escaping enslavement, sometimes just on their own, some with help. In 1839, a Washington newspaper reported an escaped enslaved man named Jim had revealed while being tortured his plan to go north following an Underground Railroad to Boston. Vigilance committees were created to protect enslaved people from bounty hunters in New York in 1835 and Philadelphia in 1838. They expanded their activities to guide enslaved people on the run. By the 1840s, the term Underground Railroad was part of the American language. And I wanted you to think about it. This isn't even 200 years ago, some of it. It's in our recent history. The Underground Railroad was a network of routes, people, and safe houses who helped the fugitive enslaved escape the South to freedom in the North and Canada during the 18th and 19th century, roughly 1780 to 1865. But believe me, it's not just limited to then. It was an informal system that was made up of free and enslaved Black people, white abolitionists, and other activists. And this is just some of the routes on the Underground Railroad. There are a lot more. For the enslaved, escaping was not easy. They first had to escape from the slaveholder. For many slaves, that meant relying on themselves to get where they would receive help. Sometimes a conductor, posing as a slave, would enter a plantation and start to guide the runaways north. Traveling at night, they would go between 10 and 20 miles to the next station. They're in the darkness there and trying to make their way, where they would eat and rest during the daytime, hiding out in barns and other places. While they waited, a message would be sent to the next station to notify its station masters. Most of the people, enslaved people helped by the Underground Railroad, escaped from border states because it wasn't that far to freedom. So we have places like Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, that it was easier if you were further into the deep South, but none of it was easy. Vigilance committees sprang up in larger towns. I mentioned those already, most prominently in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. In addition to soliciting money, lodging, and food, they helped fugitives settle into community by helping them find jobs providing letters of recommendation. But this is what happens. The greedy people that held enslaved people passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and that sometimes included people in the North. Now, enslavement was gone there, but it was a reality originally in all of the 13 colonies, by the way. But it made it helping escape, capturing enslaved people, a profitable business, and there were fewer hiding places for them. Fugitive enslaved people were typically on their own once they got to places further north. And I mentioned the conductors before. They guided the enslaved people. Hiding places included private homes, churches, barns, and schoolhouses. They were called stations, safe houses, and depots, and the people operating them were called station masters. There were many routes stretching through Ohio to Indiana and Iowa. Others headed north through Pennsylvania and to England, or through Detroit on their way to Canada. And you're going to find that eventually it's going to become more and more dangerous, even if they're in the North, to escape, even if they were legally free, which is an appalling term to me. But it's true, there were some people that were free, but they still would get captured. And this is from the Library of Congress, and it says, in the cotton field, in the swamp, and then it shows the man that had achieved freedom. Not all escaped enslaved, then known as fugitives or runaways, but today called freedom seekers, sought the help of the Underground Railroad, and they all didn't even know that it existed because it's very informal. They used various methods to escape, including forged free passes that designated them as free blacks, or fled to the swamps and mountains or Native American communities to the west. Some even shipped themselves north. This is a true story. This is Henry Box Brown. He mailed himself in a wooden crate from Richmond to Philadelphia to the Anti-Slavery Society. And there he is, obtaining his freedom. The Underground Railroad used a variety of terms to define members' responsibilities. And I mentioned these before, but there's agents who alert enslaved people to the railroad's existence. You can imagine how tricky this is if they're in the deep south, trying to get even the way to speak to them. Conductors, those who guide freedom seekers from where they were enslaved to safe houses and ultimately to freedom. And there could be multiple people that did this. Station masters who operated the safe houses and hid freedom seekers in their homes or places of employment, and stockholders who did not provide who provided financial support, but otherwise did not participate directly. The Ohio River, separating slave from free, was called the River Jordan. And Canada, where the freedom seekers were safe from slave catchers, and you'll see why this is important, was the promised land or heaven. And here's a poster, cuts off part of it, but it's Harriet Tubman. I know you're very aware of who she is, and it says, wanted, dead or alive, for stealing slaves, Harriet Moses, who leads enslaved to the promised land of freedom. And that's quote unquote. Harriet Tubman, $40,000. And the money at that time, it says, I'll read you what's on there. Negro slave, about 5 feet tall, scars on her neck, a deep scar on her forehead, plain woman of short stature, and so on. The conditions that escaped slaves experienced on the Underground Railroad could be very harsh and difficult. They often traveled at night and used the stars, such as the North Star, to guide them to the north to the free states and Canada. Traveling at night allowed the escaped slaves to hide under the cover of darkness. The slaves would usually wait at stations during the day where they would eat and rest. And then they would go at night. And the journey was difficult. So they had to travel on foot, and they needed to go at least 10 to 20 miles every night. And imagine if you had children with you. The conductors often led slaves on routes that weaved across the terrain to prevent them from being captured. And this added to the distance that the enslaved had to travel, but helped them avoid capture. And I showed you this picture before, but it says 28 fugitives escaping from the eastern shore of Maryland. And as I mentioned before, the enslaved that were closer to the free states of the North had a better chance of escaping in that direction than those that were held further south. Even those held in lower Georgia still tried to flee north. Others attempted to flee to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished in 1829, or west to Indian Territory, where they hoped to be taken in by sympathetic Native Americans beyond the reach of the U.S. authorities, because obviously the Native Americans had already dealt with losing their land and their freedom. The flight south was not new in the 19th century, as Spanish Florida had become a sanctuary for freedom seekers. I talked about that in the mid 18th century. In 1738, as I mentioned before, Fort Mose was established, and a garrison escaped enslaved from British colonies of North America, and first legally recognized free black settlement on the continent. You know this doesn't last long, and the Spanish requirement was that they become Catholic and serve in the militia, some of them as well. The maritime industry was an important source for sharing information. In addition to offering employment and transportation, the Pacific West Coast became a destination because of its ties to the whaling industry. Military service, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, was an additional option. Thousands of African Americans joined to gain freedom. Once that was legal, and I said that with the greatest of irony, so that would happen during the Civil War. During the Civil War, many freedom seekers sought protection to freedom by escaping to the Union Army lines, and that does happen. And this is part of the U.S. colored troops. They were not allowed during the Civil War to serve with the white troops, and they are led usually by a white soldier, but many of them found freedom from enslavement during the Civil War when they served, where there was tons of problems, but it was one option at the time for them. I know that many of you have heard of the 44th Massachusetts. So that was a route to freedom. Can you imagine having to fight in a horrific war? After the American Revolution, thousands of loyalists and enslaved people were settled on British-controlled islands. The loyalists attempted to forge a new cotton king on the islands, failed. Enslavement was legal in British possessions till 1834, but the plantation system didn't take there because of the poor soil of the islands. The population of the islands was also, the majority was Black, and by the 1840s, right historians Irvin Winsborough, who's from this area, and Joe Netsch, the Bahamas were a hotbed of resistance to slavery and a destination for regional liberated or escaped enslaved. Local imperial practices allowed Blacks to own land and have access to education and to legally marry. Moreover, Black Bohemians had grown strong enough in their collective efforts to pressure London for civil and human rights. Now, remember, that wasn't always true of Britain, that were unknown in the antebellum South. Under British law, these escapees weren't considered fugitives because escaping from slavery. So things changed over time with them. And another country wasn't a crime. And in 1825, Britain declared that anybody who's in the Bahamas was free. And the action further inflamed the passions of U.S. slave masters against Britain. I'm not excusing Britain. I'm not excusing any of us, because all of our ancestors were complicit in that if we are U.S. citizens. Not only did at one point or another, the ruling immediately freed 300 American runaways in the islands, but also probably stipulated numerous other American bondspeople to contemplate freedom in the Bahamas. And this was from J. Store, called the Saltwater Road. Indeed, by 1830s, a total of at least 6,000 enslaved people had made their way to the islands. By 1841, a ship called Creole, carrying over 100 enslaved people from Virginia to New Orleans, was liberated by revolt. They sailed the ship to Nassau and sparked an international incident. They would ultimately be released, even those initially charged with mutiny. Pro-slavery forces on the mainland were outraged by this and other successful escapees to the islands. By the early 1840s, and this is still part of that same article, 40% of the territorial Florida was enslaved. An escape route of this magnitude presented an enormous threat. Winsborough and Netsch detailed the diplomatic wrangling between Washington, D.C. and London over 7 slaves who made it to Nassau from St. Augustine in 1843. Remember, I've talked about how St. Augustine area, Fort Mose, was free at one point. Ultimately, the 7 would not be returned to enslavement on the mainland, an outcome that enraged American Secretary of State John C. Calhoun. And I'll let you think about where you hear that name later on. Later negotiations would compensate the alleged owners of these human beings. Compensate. But the Bahamas across the Saltwater Railroad remained a major sticking point in U.S.-British relations until most of the enslavement states broke away from the Union in 1861. By the time of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the islands were famous as a refuge of self-emancipation. And that could be another whole topic of how people escaped there. And here we're going to talk about read and ponder the Fugitive Slave Law, which disregards all the ordinary securities of personal liberty, which tramples on the Constitution by its denial, and on it goes. And let me read to you about the one of 1793 and the one of 1850. Enacted by Congress in 1793, the first Fugitive Slave Act authorized local governments to seize and return escapees to their owners and impose penalties on anyone who aided in their flight. Widespread resistance to the 1793 law led to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which added more provisions regarding runaways. So it goes from worse to even worse, or I don't think that's correct grammar, but you know what I mean. And levied even harsher punishments on interfering with their capture. The Fugitive Slave Acts were among the most controversial laws of the early 19th century. As well, they should be. They're horrible. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was part of the Compromise of 1850. This makes things even more difficult. The act required that slaves would be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free slave state. So you could go to a state you thought was free and lose your freedom. The act also made the federal government responsible for their finding, returning, and trying escaped enslaved, and mandated that officials and citizens of free states assist in this process. The act heightened tensions between the North and the South, refusing to be complicit in the institution of enslavement. Most northern states intentionally neglected to enforce the laws. Several even passed personal liberty laws that gave runaways the right to a jury trial if they were captured, and protected free blacks, many of them who had been abducted by bounty hunters and sold into enslavement. So you can see why it became worse and worse. And eventually the only place one could be free if they hadn't escaped to the islands was to go to Canada if they went on that traditional routes of the Underground Railroad. And let me tell you about this here. And this shows 4 men attempting to escape enslavement, where they are tracked down by bounty hunters and shot Let me read you a little bit. It was an impassioned condemnation of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. This print shows a group of 4 black men, possibly freedmen, ambushed by white men, 6 armed whites. They're in a cornfield. One of the whites fires on them, while 2 of his companions reload their muskets. 2 of the blacks evidently have been hit. One has fallen to the ground while the second staggers, while 2 of his one of the white men fire on them while 2 reload their muskets. And that's when this occurred. And one of them is clutching their bleeding head while the other is on the ground. And below the picture are 2 texts, which you can't really read there. One is says the Holy Bible from Deuteronomy. Thou shalt not deliver unto the master his servant, which has escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even you among you, and shall oppress him. Which basically they're saying you should not return the enslaved to their master. They should have their freedom. And the second is from the Declaration of Independence. We hold that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a political print of the time period, and it shows the reality that hate could happen to many who escaped enslavement. The Quakers were one of the first groups to actively help enslaved people. Of course, the most help came from blacks, African Americans, enslaved and free alike. But the Quakers, peacemakers, helped escape enslaved people. George Washington complained that Quakers had attempted to liberate one of his enslaved workers. In the early 1800s, Isaac T. Hopper, a Quaker abolitionist, set up a network in Philadelphia that helped enslaved people on the run. At the same time, Quakers in North Carolina, which would be even further south, harder to escape, established abolitionist groups that began routes and shelters for escapees. Levi and Catherine Coffin were also Quakers. The Coffins turned their home in Newport, Indiana, into a safe house, and it is estimated that they had over 2,000 escaped enslaved. In 1847, they moved to Cincinnati and opened a warehouse that produced free labor goods. And there's their house at that time period, and now as it is today, a place you can visit. And there's so many people, some that we won't ever even know their names, that contributed to this effort. And realize it's before the first 2 fugitive slave acts that are going to make things even more difficult. And I do mention a few names here, but I want to tell you there are many people. I couldn't look into them all. I couldn't tell all their stories, and all of them aren't known. So please keep on reading or researching. And this is a church where many escaped enslaved stayed. Activists, Black denominations were at the forefront of work on the Underground Railroad, but rarely recognized in written history. In African American and white Protestant denominations, religion operated as one of the main pillars of the Underground Railroad. African Methodist denominations, particularly the African Methodist Episcopal AME and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion AMEZ, almost unanimously supported the Underground Railroad. African American churches took the lead in the battle for abolition and assisting the enslaved to freedom. Underground Railroad activism operated inside denominations, churches, and congregations, as well as through personal actions, and in the home of abolitionists, Black and white. In Middletown, Connecticut, Pittsburgh, Louisville, St. Louis, and Detroit, and among many other towns and cities. The original Black church building that often stood at or near river's edge to help those escapees via water. African Americans have been escaping slavery since its earliest days in the Underground Railroad in the United States, and way before we even have a written history. Some of the most effective Underground Railroad activists, were ministers who had once been enslaved, and this is one of those places that had people. This is an interesting picture. It's called A Ride for Liberty, the fugitive slave Eastman Johnson. And Eastman Johnson portrays an enslaved family charging for the safety of the Union lines in the dull light of dawn. There's 3 of them on this horse. Johnson based the painting on an event he witnessed near the Manassas, Virginia battlefield on March 2nd, 1862. Just days before this Confederate stronghold was ceded to Union forces. But at that time, there were Union troops supposedly off in the distance over there to the left behind the horse. You can see the glimmer of their swords. I don't know. That's what that was supposed to depict. And this family, he believes, escaped to the north because there were Union troops there to protect them. Manassas will have 2 battles, by the way, during the Civil War. It's another topic, and I don't feel very qualified to speak about it. This is called Hidden in View, Secret Story of the Quilts in the Underground Railroad. And this woman, 2 people researched, and they found the story of a woman who said their ancestors helped guide people to the north by leaving clues in their quilts. And this came out about 1999, I believe. And it has caused a lot of controversy. It's called Hidden in Plain View, and it says that different patterns symbolize different routes on the Underground Railroad. For example, the monkey wrench quilt block is said to be the first block to appear, indicating enslaved people should get ready to escape. It became popular and controversial because they're going to tell the story of one woman's unrecorded narrative, which, or believe me, I believe in oral history, and added other information about quilts of the era in the lives of the enslaved. And museums in Missouri, Florida, and Michigan have held shows featuring authentic quilt codes. There are even math or history lessons using them. And there are people that say that there is no evidence at all. This is according to Tracy Vaughn Manley, a Black Studies professor at Northwestern University. She studies Black quilting, and she says there's evidence that enslaved people made utilitarian quilts from old clothing and scraps of fabric given to them by their enslavers. Based on her research and the research of highly regarded slave historians, according to her, there's no evidence, no letters, no notes, nothing that would signify that this was used. And I will tell you that I am not qualified to talk about this, because it is so controversial. It says that according to legend, a safe house along the Underground Railroad was often indicated by a quilt hanging from a clothesline or a windowsill, and the quilts were embedded with a kind of code. And it has caused great controversy between the 2 groups that believe that it happened and it didn't happen. And what I can say is, if it didn't happen, I think it still presents some history of the time. And it's very important to feel that their ancestors contributed to freedom. And it gives a sense of the history and how much people wanted to be free. But do I know if it's true or not? I can't answer that. I would say that that's something you need to research. It is divided people in in that people will say, you're trying to take our history from us. I'm a white woman. I'm not qualified to speak on that. In fact, I'm very humbled by even presenting about the Underground Railroad. But I will say that there are people in the Black community that believe this absolutely happened, and there are many that don't. So read this book. This is just one woman's oral history. There are other people that have other oral history that believe this is true. And then there are those that do not believe it's true. And it's caused a great division. Quilts give people a way to express their feelings. That much I know. As I'm very poor with my hands, I would not ever have been able to be a quilter. But you research and you find out the story, and I will leave it there. After Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, now you can't even be in the North and feel like you've reached freedom, because you could be captured, taken back to the South. Even if you never lived in the South and you had lived in a city, it didn't matter. So Canada became a haven for many attempting to obtain their freedom. And this made it possible and profitable to hire slave seekers to find and arrest people. This was a disaster in the North, United States, the Northern United States, for Black freedom seekers. They can't even go to the North. They have to go all the way to Canada. Slave catchers often kidnap African Americans who were legally free people. But these seizures and kidnappings persuaded more and more people to offer aid as part of the Underground Railroad. And the individuals, couples, and even families, can you imagine a whole family, children has participated in the Underground Railroad. Formerly enslaved men and women also played a significant role in aiding freedom seekers, such as the Clemens family. James and Sophia Clemens established the Greenville community in Western Ohio. In addition to its founding a school and a cemetery, they used their home as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Greenville even became a final stop for a number of freedom seekers, and there's the home. And this is from a National Park Service article, and that talks about they have maps and things that show a part of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement were most likely the first time in American history there was an interracial coalition, and the role of the Quakers was essential. Though I did talk about some things that happened in Florida as well. It was, however, run by free Northern African Americans, especially in its early years. William Still from Philadelphia conducted with the assistance of white abolitionists, many of whom were Quakers. This is him, known as the father of the Underground Railroad. Still helped 800 slaves escape to freedom, enslaved, interviewing each person and keeping records, including a brief biography and destination of each person, along with any aliases they adopted. Though he kept his records carefully hidden. I find that absolutely amazing. One of those escaped enslaved whom he helped was his older brother, Peter, who he had never met. Still worked with the other Underground Railroad agents operating in the South and in counties in southern Pennsylvania. His network also included agents in New Jersey, New York, New England, and Canada. Harriet Tubman, I'll talk more about her. I already mentioned her, traveled through his area with passengers on several occasions during the 1850s. After the Civil War, Still published his secret notes he had kept in diaries during the time. That's amazing. And was a source of historical information of the workings of the Underground Railroad, because there's still so much that we don't know about. But we have little glimpses here of their oral history and written history. The Harriet Beecher Stowe home, located at 63 Federal Street in Brunswick, Maine, was the rented home of Harriet Beecher Stowe and her family from 1850 to 1852. I did a presentation on her. And her husband was Calvin Stowe. He was a professor of theology at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. And while she was there, and her husband even didn't come as soon as she did. And it was known that she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin while living in Brunswick. But what wasn't known until the past few years was that she also sheltered John Andrew Jackson, a fugitive and enslaved person from South Carolina. Her arrival in Brunswick coincided with the passage of the first Fugitive Slave Act. And she did hide somebody as part of the Underground Railroad system. Currently, her home, when I first went to Brunswick, as I volunteered at the Joshua Chamberlain Museum, and he's a person that heard her read the serial form of Uncle Tom's Cabin. That place was like an inn and a restaurant, and I ate there. But eventually it was bought by Bowdoin College, and there are offices there. But they also created a space called Harriet's Writing Room that's open in the summer. And it talks about, you can find out a little bit. You'll have to research. It's open this summer. And if there's somebody there that can talk to you about Harriet Beecher Stowe's work, where she wrote. So it's not just a national historic landmark because she's writing Uncle Tom's Cabin Act. She has the vision in the First Parish Church, but she also hid an enslaved man as part of the National Underground Railroad. And it's part of that National Underground Railroad network to Freedom site that's run by the National Park Service. And it looks different today, but I wanted you to get a picture of what it looked like maybe 30 or 40 years before. And there's a sign, if you go by there, there's Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it tells the history. She was joined for regular readings of her work in progress, the book that started the Civil War. Well, that's what Abraham Lincoln said. Her sister, Catherine Beecher, and others in the community, including then student future Civil War hero, Maine Governor and Bowdoin President Joshua Chamberlain. It tells the history of the house. And Henry Wadsworth Longfellow actually rented a room there, and he had actually lived in the house that Chamberlain had, and was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1962. Bowdoin College acquired the house in 2001, and in 2016, it's the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Think about how long it took to discover that. And here's an abolitionist and an Underground Railroad participant that was very controversial because of his violence. Like his father, John Brown took part in the Underground Railroad. He hired runaways at his home and warehouse and creating an anti-slave catcher militia following the 1850 passage of the Fugitive Slave Act with several of his sons. Those are, he did some wonderful things. And then he participated in the Bleeding Kansas conflict, leading one 1856 raid that resulted in the murder of 5 pro-slavery settlers. Another raid freed 11 enslaved people, which was wonderful, from 3 Missouri plantations. And after that, Brown took his hotly pursued charges on a 1,500-mile journey to Canada. But then he becomes extremely radicalized. And his last action takes place in October of 1859, when he had 21 followers seize the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry to incite a large-scale enslaved rebellion. And I'll let you read about him and find out all you can and discover what you think about him. And he was quickly convicted, and he was hung that December. But he definitely was strongly anti-enslavement. Harriet Tubman traveled at night so that she would not be seen by what was then called slave catchers. She followed the North Star as her guide, and she was the first person to help her was a Quaker, and she gave her shelter the first night, instructions on what to do next. The woman was part of the Underground Railroad network that provided shelter and transportation. The most common route for people fleeing enslavement was northeast along the Choptank River through Delaware and then north into Pennsylvania. A journey of 90 miles to Philadelphia on foot would have most likely taken between 5 days and 3 weeks. 5 days would be if everything had gone perfectly. The details of her journey of freedom are unknown because other escapees used the routes. Tubman did not discuss them until many years later because she was worried that someone would be caught. She called the experience of entering Pennsylvania years later. And by the way, Pennsylvania is a huge place on the Underground Railroad. When I found that I'd crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. A great stampede of slaves. The Anti-Slavery Bugle, Salem, Ohio. This is where that came from, this article. A great stampede of slaves took place at Cambridge, Maryland on Saturday last night. No less than 30 made their escape, 15 belonging to Samuel Pedersen Esquire, 7 to Miss Jane Carter, 1 to Richard Keene, 1 to W.B. Brancock, and 1 to Richard D. Phillips, 1 to the estate of William Travers, deceased, and 2 free Negroes. Dates make 44 who have left that place within 2 weeks. Messrs. Patillon and Phillips and Brannock offered a reward of $3,100 for the apprehension of their enslaved. And this ties into her, and I'll explain how between 1850 through 1860, she returned to Maryland between 11 and 13 times, approximately 70 family members and others to freedom. She made her first trip back in 1850 when she discovered her niece was going to be auctioned off, and she made a plan with her niece's husband, a free man. And she used the skills she learned while observing the stars and working in the fields to guide people to freedom. She made her last trip in 1860 when Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which allowed authorities in non-slave states to capture and return slaves to their owners. Tubman helped reroute the Underground Railroad to Canada. In October of 1857, this is the article, 2 groups of enslaved people escaped from Cambridge, Maryland. Tubman not guide them, but she aided them, providing detailed instructions, so she helped them. 44 men, women, and children escaped in what was described in the press as a great stampede of slaves. She also gave instructions to other enslaved who found their way to freedom. Originally, it was thought that she helped hundreds, but I think she did. It's just not that she personally guided them all. She personally guided 70. And here is Frederick Douglass, and that was not his original name. I believe it was Bailey. And his mother grew up on a different plantation, lived on a different plantation. I can't even tell you his whole story in detail. In fact, I think someday I'm going to do a presentation on him because he's such an amazing man. He's just not an abolitionist. He's a suffragist, and he also is involved in the Underground Railroad. In January 1st, 1836, he made a resolution he was going to be free by the end of the year. He planned an escape, but in April, he was in jail after his plan was discovered. He had many failed attempts. I can't go into detail now, but I promise I'll talk about him sometime this year. He finally realized his dream. He had some help, and he fled Baltimore while working at a shipyard. And he has a uniform that makes him look like he's a sailor. And then traveling by train, then steamboat, then train, he arrived in New York City the following day. Several weeks later, he settles in New Bedford, Massachusetts, living with his newlywed bride under the new name of Frederick Douglass. New name because he's no longer enslaved. Plus, he wants to be able to not be caught. Douglass, the formerly enslaved abolitionist, suffragist, author, and orator, he hid fugitives in his home in Rochester, New York, helping 400 freedom seekers make their way to Canada. There's several Frederick Douglass homes. New Bedford, it goes under another name, but you can find it. New York, his original home was no longer there. But in New York City, there's a place, and in Washington, D.C. And then when his first wife dies, he does marry a woman. And it was controversial at that time because not only was she 20 years younger, but she was white. but he always continues his work until he dies of a heart attack. Keep reading about him, and I'll speak about him later. And this is Thaddeus Stevens, a congressperson who did not hide his anti-slavery views. He was a promoter of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which promised Black citizens equal protection under the law and the right to vote, respectively. He also favored radical reconstruction of the South, including redistribution of land from white plantation owners to former enslaved people. And he paid a spy to infiltrate a group of fugitive slave hunters in this district. But it wasn't until 2002 that archaeologists discovered a secret hiding place in the courtyard of his Lancaster home. Originally, he had lived in Gettysburg, by the way, that his Underground Railroad efforts became known. Documentary evidence has been found proving that he harbored runaway enslaved. Other prominent political figures also served as Underground station masters, including author and orator Frederick Douglass and Secretary of State William Seward, as well as his wife, Frances. And this woman right here, Lydia Hamilton Smith, is often referred to as Thaddeus Stevens' housekeeper and perhaps his common law wife. We really do not know, but she was actively a participant in the Underground Railroad and held deeply to her faith to pursue good works at nearly every juncture. And here is where they believed that they would have kept fugitive enslaved. We really don't know the extent of their relationship. If you saw the movie Lincoln, it certainly indicates that they were common law husband and wife. That could be true. She was very loyal to him. She was born near Gettysburg. She did so many great works. She counseled Stevens on his business affairs in Lancaster and DC, and she was his companion at social events. And she was constant, sometimes referred to as Mrs. Stevens. He leaves her a $500 annuity on his death in 1868, and she was dedicated to Black liberation and to help him hide people. She helped Thaddeus Stevens live a much longer life, and she also, along with him, was an advocate of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And she left money for his grave to be maintained. She was a Black woman. We don't know 100% her role in his life, but we know she was an activist and very loyal and part of the helping enslaved escape on the Underground Railroad. And this is a story that wasn't told much. There's no picture of this gentleman, but his name is Thomas Blackwood. He's a Black shoemaker who worked in the U.S. Capitol, and he helped the enslaved of the government employees escape to Canada. I wrote about these deeds under a pseudonym for an abolitionist newspaper in Albany, New York, which was part of the escape route he was using. And this author thinks that there's a lot of information about him there, not necessarily when he was alive, but they think that 1842 could be one of the earliest mentions of the Underground Railroad. I think it was a little earlier, but it was one of the early ones. And he would write letters that he would address to the rich that owned enslaved people, and which would end up being printed in the paper too. And this letter was written to Thomas Scott of Washington, D.C. about Henry Hawkins, a man that was enslaved by Scott who was on his way north. And he keeps on using the term Underground Railroad, but he helps many escape. And eventually this gentleman, and this is a book that you could buy or perhaps check out from your local library. I know the Sanibel Public Library has it. It's called Flee North, A Forgotten Hero in the Fight for Freedom in Slavery's Borderland. And eventually he will escape himself to Canada, Toronto, I believe. There's so much to tell about his story. Check him out. And here's Harriet Tubman. I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. I just want to talk briefly about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then I'm going to wrap it up. In 1863, there was the Emancipation Proclamation declaring all people held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state where that's in rebellion against the United States, I'm going to summarize this, shall be free. However, I want you to know that this proclamation only applied to people that were in states that were in, they considered rebellion against the United States. So it didn't, and all slavery in the nation, since it only applied to the areas of the Confederacy in a state of rebellion. So enslavement still existed. Now, Thaddeus Stevens and others are a proponent of the 13th Amendment, the U.S. Constitution ratified in 1865 and after the Civil War abolished enslavement in the United States. The 13th Amendment states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, whereas the party shall be duly convicted shall exist within the U.S. or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. So unless they're putting someone into enslavement, which seems kind of crazy, or convicted of such, that would put them in enslavement, there is no such thing as slavery. But the 14th and the 15th Amendment will help even further. It's amendment to the Constitution, one of the three Reconstructions amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, introduced after the Civil War. It was ratified and adopted on July 9th. I didn't put the whole thing here. You can look it up. But it said all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to this jurisdiction are citizens of the U.S. and of the state, and no state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. That means everyone. Section 1. So basically, on the 15th Amendment, you cannot have your right to vote be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The legislature shall have the power to enforce this article. But I'm going to be honest, there were still difficulties all the way up into the 1960s and beyond, where people based on their race had a hard time voting. By the way, I did not really tell you how much Frederick Douglass not only was an abolitionist, but he also was a proponent of women having the right to vote. But so we've got these laws that come that are supposed to limit these things, but it's been a long fight. There's not enslavement, but there's been denial of rights. The National Park Service, and this I think is my last slide, network, and I'm sitting in front of it right now, to freedom, for example, consists of sites with a connection to the Underground Railroad. Through collaboration with government entities and individuals and organizations, the Network to Freedom honors, preserves, and promotes the history of resistance to enslavement, though through escape and flight. The National Park Service also features a website about the Underground Railroad and associated places. Another way to recognize the places of the Underground Railroad is through the National Register of Historic Places. This National Register program, Park Service program, coordinates and supports public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological resources. A number of National Register properties have connections to the Underground Railroad. This is from a National Public Park Service site. This shows a few. There is so much more. People are discovering them every day. One of my coworkers has told me that in his, I think it was his grandparents' home, they discovered a hiding place in Massachusetts where the enslaved were hidden. I think there's so many more that we don't know about. There's so much oral history, so much unwritten history that we don't know about. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I encourage you to look up and discover more and more. And these are my sources. And I realize I talked a lot. That's a long presentation. This is something I feel very passionately about. So much is happening today. And I do want to say that I have children whose would be part of some of their ancestors' history. So I'm passionate. I care about this. I hope I've inspired you to look up more. Thank you for your support. See you next month.